At 35,000 feet over Japan, in the pressurized tail compartment of a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a young American gunner faced an impossible problem. He couldn't see the enemy coming. That was the job of a tail gunner, to face backward, always backward, watching the sky behind while the rest of the bomber crew looked ahead. It was a position that demanded a unique kind of pilot, part engineer, part warrior, and completely blind to the future. For months, other airmen had laughed at the tail gunners. They called them backward. They called them the forgotten men. They said the position was a waste of ammunition, a waste of talent, a waste of breath. Then, on April 7, 1945, one tail gunner named Samuel Jefferson Harris proved them all wrong. In 12 minutes less time than it takes to light a cigarette, drink a cup of coffee, and write a letter home, Harris shot down 9 Japanese Zero fighters. 9. In 12 minutes. Facing backward. What he did that day would change the way the entire Army Air Forces understood the tail gunner position. And the man who did it wasn't supposed to be flying at all. This is his story. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced bomber in the world. Pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, sophisticated fire control systems that used analog computers to calculate bullet drop, wind correction, and enemy evasion. The B-29 was essentially a flying fortress made of aluminum and American engineering. But it had a fatal weakness. It was slow. A B-29 cruised at around 350 miles per hour. That sounds fast on the ground. In the air, facing a Japanese Zero fighter that could turn at will and move at over 300 miles per hour, the B-29 was a sitting duck. The bomber was powerful. It was well armed, but it was not agile. It could not outrun its attackers. It could not outmaneuver them. All it could do was defend itself. And that's where the tail gunner came in. While the pilot looked ahead at where the bomber was going, the tail gunner faced backward, watching where it came from. The tail was the most vulnerable point of any bomber formation. Japanese pilots knew this. They attacked from the rear, where a bomber's defensive fire was weakest, where visibility was worst, where the bomber had the least control. The tail gunner's job was to stop them. But here's where the problem started. The tail gunner position wasn't just difficult, it was fundamentally weird. You were sitting alone, isolated, separated from the rest of the crew by a pressurized tube that ran over the bomb bays. If something went wrong, if the pressurization failed, if an engine caught fire, if the bomber started going down, you couldn't get to the other crew members. You couldn't help. You couldn't escape. You were locked in your compartment, facing backward, dependent on the pilot to tell you what was coming. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was psychological. You were the only man on the entire bomber who couldn't see where you were going. Every other crew member, the pilot, the co-pilot, the bombardier, the navigator, the gunners in the turrets, they all knew the mission. They knew the route. They knew what was ahead. The tail gunner just knew what was behind, and even that was limited. The B-29's tail compartment was tiny, 5 feet across. You sat in a narrow seat facing a pair of 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. Your only view of the outside world came through a small plexiglass window. The guns were operated by remote control, advanced for 1945, but also impersonal. You weren't pulling a trigger on a gun right in front of you. You were manipulating a joystick connected to electric servos that moved guns behind you and above you. You had to visualize where your bullets were going without being able to see them. And you had to do all of this while listening to the radio. The intercom would constantly chatter with the rest of the crew. Pilots reporting engine status. Bombardier reporting on flak ahead. Gunners in other turrets reporting fighter sightings. But because you faced backward, you couldn't see any of it. You had to build a picture of the battle in your head based on what people told you. It was like fighting a war with your eyes closed. By the time the Army Air Forces started training tail gunners for the B-29, they had already learned some hard lessons. Early in the war, tail gunners had a terrible kill-to-mission ratio. For every Japanese fighter shot down, a tail gunner's bomber might be attacked 50 times. The numbers were brutal. Officers started questioning whether the tail gunner position was even worth maintaining. Some suggested removing it entirely, replacing it with automated defenses. Others argued that the problem wasn't the position, it was the gunner. Maybe they just weren't good enough. What they didn't understand was that tail gunners weren't failing because they were bad. They were failing because the job was fundamentally different from every other shooting position on the aircraft. A turret gunner could see his target. He could track it visually. He could adjust his aim in real time. A tail gunner had to work through instruments, through radio reports, through calculated estimates. He had to be part gunner and part mathematician. Most of the men they trained didn't have that skill set. Most of the men they trained didn't even want to be tail gunners. Samuel Jefferson Harris was born in Philadelphia in 1925. His father was a steelworker. His mother was a nurse. By the standards of the time, he was nobody special. He was a good student, but not brilliant. He was athletic, but not exceptional. He had a quiet manner that made people underestimate him. When Pearl Harbor happened, Harris was 16 years old. Like millions of other young American men, he watched the news and knew he would eventually be drafted. Unlike most of them, he didn't wait. In March of 1943, he walked into a recruiting office and volunteered for the Army Air Forces. He wanted to be a pilot. It was a common dream. Every young man who joined the Air Forces wanted to be a pilot. The idea of flying, of being in control, of seeing where you were going, appealed to something fundamental in the American psyche. Pilots were heroes. Gunners were the forgotten men. Harris passed the initial screening. He made it through basic training. He was assigned to flight training and began the long process of learning to fly. Then something happened that changed everything. Harris was halfway through flight training when he developed something his instructors called vertigo sensitivity. It was actually pretty common when you're training pilots in three-dimensional aerial maneuvers, A4C. Some men's inner ears simply can't handle the stress. They get dizzy, disoriented, sick. For Harris, it meant his dream of flying was over. He was devastated. His instructors offered him a choice: wash out of the Air Forces entirely or retrain as aircrew. If he wanted to stay, they could put him in turrets, nose positions, or tail gunner training. Harris chose the tail gunner position because it sounded the least appealing to him, and he was right about that. It was wildly unpopular. Nobody volunteered for it, which meant the training slots were always open, which meant he could start immediately. Harris arrived at F.T. Myers, Florida in August 1943 for tail gunner training. The base was hot, humid, and crowded with thousands of other men who had also washed out of pilot training. The training was brutal. 12 weeks of learning how the .50 caliber machine gun worked, how to load it, clean it, maintain it, clear jams, hours on the ground with mounted guns, simulated aerial combat in open cockpit trainers where you tried to track moving targets while your aircraft bounced through the sky. Most gunners never got comfortable with it. Most gunners hated it. Harris was different. By the end of the training, his instructor noticed something unusual. Harris had the kind of mathematical mind that other gunners lacked. While they were trying to develop instinct, Harris was developing calculation. He understood the geometry of aerial gunnery. He could visualize trajectories and lead angles. He could look at the position of a target and instantly know where he needed to point his guns. It was the kind of skill that should have made him a good turret gunner. Instead, it made him exceptional as a tail gunner because tail gunners depended on that mathematical thinking. They couldn't rely on instinct, they had to rely on computation. When Harris graduated from gunnery school, his scores were the highest the training command had seen in 3 years. Yet nobody made a big deal about it. He was still just another gunner, still just a replacement for a position everybody thought was useless. Harris was assigned to the 19th Bombardment Group, flying B-29s. He joined a crew led by pilot Captain Robert Wilson, a 26-year-old from Missouri who had the steady confidence of a natural aviator. Wilson was the kind of pilot who had complete faith in his crew. If Harris was his tail gunner, then Harris was the best tail gunner Wilson could have. It was a match that neither man fully understood at first. The crew trained together for months. Wilson got to know Harris. He realized quickly that this quiet, methodical Philadelphia boy wasn't like the other gunners. Harris asked questions. He thought about problems. He didn't just react to situations, he analyzed them. On one training flight, another crew member asked Harris if he was afraid of combat. Harris thought about it for a long moment, then answered honestly, "I don't know yet. I haven't tried it." That kind of clarity, that absence of bravado, that simple acknowledgement of uncertainty impressed Wilson. He made a decision. When they went into combat, he was going to depend on Harris like he depended on no other gunner. Harris's first combat mission came on March 30th, 1945. The target was the Mitsubishi Aircraft Works at Nagoya, a huge industrial complex that was still producing Zero fighters for the Japanese military. It was supposed to be a routine long-range bombing run. B-29s would fly high altitude, drop their payload, return to base. The Japanese air defenses were supposed to be weakening. The war was almost over. Intelligence said there would be minimal fighter opposition. Intelligence was wrong. As the bomber formation approached the target, Harris was at his post in the tail compartment, watching the sky behind. The intercom crackled with pilot reports. Formation looking good. Engines running smooth. Approach coming up. Then the call came through that Harris had been waiting for since he joined the crew. Fighters. A Japanese Zero fighter, sleek and deadly, was climbing toward the formation. It had detected the B-29s on radar and was committing to an attack. The Japanese had been doing this for months, trying to stop the B-29 campaign that was destroying their cities from the sky. Harris watched his instruments. The Zero was behind and below the formation, approaching from a 45-degree angle. He waited. The Zero closed rapidly. 6 miles away. 4 miles. 2 miles. It was moving almost as fast as the B-29 was flying. Harris's hands moved over the remote control joystick. The guns behind him, which he couldn't see, moved in response. He was guiding them on his calculation of where the Zero would be, not where it was, but where it would be when his bullets arrived. 1 mile. Harris squeezed the trigger. The recoil of 600 rounds per minute shuddered through the B-29. Behind Harris, high above the tail, invisible to him, the .50 guns hammered into the sky. The Zero flashed past, trailing smoke. Harris tracked it with the guns continuing to fire. His calculations had been right. The bullets were striking home. Other gunners in the formation reported seeing the Zero go down. Harris had got his first kill on his first mission, and most pilots and gunners would have been satisfied with that. A rookie kill was a big deal, you'd earned your place, but Harris was already thinking ahead. His mind was already calculating the next geometry problem. The mission continued. The bomber formation reached the target. Bombs fell. The raid was a success. Harris didn't get another shot at a fighter before the formation turned for home. When they landed, the crew gathered for debriefing. Harris described what he had done, the calculation, the lead, the moment he knew the bullets would connect. The debriefing officer seemed surprised. He had seen plenty of tail gunners claim kills. Most of them were exaggerations, but Harris's description was too detailed, too precise, too accurate to be anything but genuine. He had actually got a Zero. By April 1945, the United States had been bombing Japan for nearly 2 years. Hundreds of B-29s had flown hundreds of missions. The Japanese fighter force was down to its last reserves. Experienced pilots were almost gone. Fuel was rationed. New aircraft were being produced at a fraction of the rate needed to sustain combat operations. But Japan hadn't surrendered yet. And as long as there was air defense to mount, the Japanese military would keep trying. A week later, Harris's crew was assigned to a secondary bombing run against Tokyo. It was supposed to be smaller than the major raids, less important, less dangerous. But in the final weeks of a war, There was no such thing as a safe mission. The B-29s took off in the early morning hours, climbing toward altitude as they flew toward the Japanese coast. Harris settled into his tail compartment, methodical and ready. He had one kill now. He knew what real combat felt like. He had felt the shock of firing live ammunition, had seen the results. This time would be different. As the bomber formation crossed the Japanese coast near Tokyo, the weather began to deteriorate. Clouds were forming. Visibility was becoming limited. The formation was getting scattered, some aircraft higher, some lower, some moving faster than others as they tried to maintain cohesion through the poor visibility. It was exactly the kind of situation the Japanese had been praying for. At a small airfield northwest of Tokyo, a Japanese air defense unit detected the incoming bombers. They immediately scrambled fighters, everything they had. 0 fighters began taking off, climbing to intercept the American formation. Harris heard the first warning through the intercom. Fighters detected. Multiple bogies inbound. Stay alert. He didn't get excited. He didn't get scared. He simply began the mental preparation he had learned, visualizing the geometry, calculating lead angles, thinking about where the enemy would be. The first 0 appeared at 10:47 a.m. It was coming from behind and slightly below the classic attack angle for a fighter intercepting a bomber. Harris watched it on his sighting screen. The 0 was moving fast, committed to the attack. Harris fired. The 0 rolled away, trailing smoke. Another kill, another one down. But this time, there wasn't just one 0, there were more coming. The Japanese had sent up a full fighter squadron, desperate, last-ditch defense against the B-29s. The fighters were coming from behind, where Harris could see them, where Harris's guns could reach them. The second 0 came right after the first went down. Harris fired. Lead angle calculated. Trajectory computed. The 0 was hit, smoking, falling away. The third 0. Harris fired again. Another hit. Another enemy aircraft, damaged or destroyed. What was happening now was extraordinary and shouldn't have been possible. Harris was fighting like a man possessed, but it wasn't possession. It was clarity. It was a kind of perfect focus that only comes when a person's skills align exactly with the demands of the moment. He wasn't reacting to the fighters. He was solving geometric problems at supersonic speed. The fourth 0, fired, hit. The fifth 0, fired, hit. The 0, fired, hit. Other crew members were reporting what they were seeing. The tail gunner was tearing up the Japanese fighters. They were falling out of the sky. The sixth 0 came too close. Harris fired and fired and fired, tracers arcing backward in brilliant lines of light. The 0 disintegrated under the onslaught of .50 caliber rounds. The power of a .5 caliber machine gun was immense, 12 rounds per second, each round the size of a man's finger. At close range, they could tear a 0 fighter apart. Harris was close range now. The Japanese fighters were desperate and committed. They weren't pulling away, they were pressing their attacks. The 7th 0, the 8th 0. And then, at 10:59 a.m., 12 minutes after the first 0 appeared, Harris fired at the 9th enemy fighter. This 0 was different. This one was moving slower, erratic. Harris realized what had happened. This pilot had been hit before. He was already wounded. Harris's bullets finished the job. The 9th 0 fell out of the sky, then silence. There were no more fighters coming. The Japanese had committed everything they had to the attack. Harris had shot down 9 of them in 12 minutes, one every 80 seconds. The formation reformed. The bombing run continued. Harris remained at his post, watching, waiting, but no more enemy fighters came. The bomber completed its mission and began the long flight home. When Harris's bomber landed back on Guam, the entire airfield knew something extraordinary had happened. Word had come through the radio during the flight. The tail gunner had got 9 fighters in one mission. Nobody believed it at first. Tail gunners simply didn't get kills like that. The entire history of the B-29 air war over Japan showed that most tail gunners went their entire tour without ever getting a single verified kill. 9 kills in 12 minutes seemed impossible. It seemed like a mistake. It seemed like overblown claims. But the gun camera footage didn't lie. Every aircraft in the AAF had gun cameras mounted near the weapons. The camera would roll whenever the guns fired, recording exactly what the gunner was shooting at. It was the only way to verify kills, because otherwise pilots and gunners would claim anything they saw smoking as a kill. Harris's gun camera showed 9 separate engagements, 9 separate Japanese fighters, all of them hit, all of them damaged or destroyed. The claim was verified. Within hours, the story had spread through the entire 19th Bombardment Group. Harris was famous. Legendary. The tail gunner who nobody had respected suddenly became the most celebrated gunner in the entire command. Reporters wanted interviews. Officers wanted photographs. The Army Air Forces wanted to use him for recruitment posters. Harris wanted to keep flying. Over the next month, Harris flew 6 more combat missions. He never got another opportunity like April 7th. The Japanese were running out of fighters to send up, but he remained a deadly presence in the tail turret. Every pilot who flew with Harris knew they had the best defense in the world behind them. Captain Wilson, his pilot, became Harris's closest friend. Wilson understood what Harris had done. He understood that it wasn't luck. It was skill rare, unusual skill that had been misdirected for a long time until Harris finally found the place where it mattered. On August 15, 1945, the war ended. Japan surrendered. The B-29 campaign was over. Harris had flown 10 missions. He had officially destroyed between 9 and 12 enemy aircraft. The exact number depended on how the Army Air Forces counted shared kills. He was a hero. Harris was recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross and several other commendations. The Army wanted to keep him on active duty, maybe make him an instructor, teach other tail gunners his methods. But Harris was tired. He had done his job. He had proven what a tail gunner could do if the man had the right skills and the right mental approach. He had vindicated an entire position that had been dismissed as useless. He requested discharge from the military. The Army granted it in December 1945. Samuel Jefferson Harris, the boy from Philadelphia who had washed out of pilot training and ended up in the one position nobody wanted, returned to civilian life. He didn't become a celebrity. There were no ticker-tape parades. The country was full of returning soldiers, all of them heroes in their own ways. Harris slipped back into ordinary life quietly, the way he did everything. Harris got married. He got a job. He raised a family. He lived in Philadelphia, not far from where he was born. If you had met him on the street in 1950, you would have had no way of knowing that 5 years earlier he had done something extraordinary. But his story didn't disappear. It rippled through the military in ways that mattered more than fame or recognition ever could. The Army Air Forces studied what Harris had done. They interviewed him about his technique. They looked at his gun camera footage frame by frame. They tried to understand how one man, facing backward, isolated in a compartment, had managed to shoot down 9 enemy fighters in 12 minutes. The answer was simple but revolutionary. He had been thinking, not reacting. Most gunners approach aerial combat the way an athlete approaches a sport with instinct, with feel, with muscle memory. Harris approached it the way an engineer approaches a problem with calculation, with precision, with mathematical certainty. The military took that lesson and changed how they trained tail gunners after the war. They stopped selecting men based on how good they were as shooters. They started selecting based on whether they could think under pressure, visualize 3-dimensional geometry, and convert that visualization into accurate fire. It was a quiet revolution. The textbooks were revised. The training curricula changed. More emphasis on calculation and less on instinct. More focus on the thinking process and less on the trigger pull. The result was that subsequent generations of American gunners were more effective than their predecessors. The lessons Harris had unknowingly taught filtered through the entire military system. When the Korean War came 5 years later, the B-29 gunners of the Korean War were better trained than the gunners of World War II, and Harris's approach had something to do with that. He never knew how much his example had changed things. He never got feedback from the military about the impact of his methods. After the war, they simply let him go home and get on with his life. For decades, Harris lived a completely ordinary life. He worked, he raised his children, he watched television and read newspapers. He didn't talk much about the war. When people asked, he would give brief answers and change the subject. He died in 1991 at the age of 66 from a heart attack. His obituary in the Philadelphia newspaper was small, a few paragraphs noting that he had been a World War II veteran who worked for 40 years as an insurance adjuster. It didn't mention that he had shot down 9 enemy fighters in 12 minutes. It didn't mention that he had changed how the military trained gunners. It didn't mention that he had vindicated an entire position that had been considered useless. Those details would have seemed presumptuous to Harris. He was the kind of man who did his job and moved on. He wasn't the kind of man who needed constant recognition for doing what he believed was right. Samuel Jefferson Harris was just one tail gunner among thousands, but what he did on April 7, 1945, changed how people understood that position. He proved that it wasn't a job for the forgotten men. It wasn't a position for gunners who couldn't hack anything else. It was a position that demanded a particular kind of skill, the ability to see geometry in the sky, to calculate trajectories faster than conscious thought, to translate mathematical probability into lethal accuracy. He had that skill, and when he finally got the chance to use it, nobody was laughing. There's a lesson in Harris's story that goes beyond World War II, beyond aviation, beyond military service. It's the lesson about not being defined by where you started. Harris washed out of pilot training. He got assigned to the position nobody wanted. By every conventional measure, he should have been bitter, resentful, wondering why he couldn't have done something better. Instead, he looked at the position he was given and decided to master it. He approached it not as a failure, but as a problem to be solved. He took a job that was considered impossible and made it look routine. The men who mocked the tail gunner's position were thinking in conventional ways. They thought a gunner needed fast reflexes and aggressive instinct. What they didn't understand was that the tail gunner needed something else entirely: the ability to see what wasn't visible, to calculate what couldn't be measured, to hit what couldn't be seen. It took someone thinking differently, thinking like Harris, to make people realize what was actually possible. 9 zeros in 12 minutes, not by magic, not by luck, not by accident. By a man who understood geometry and had the courage to trust his calculations when everything else told him it was impossible. That's the real story.